Hello, this is Modern Mongolia. I'm your host Donna. Here I candidly talk about Mongolian life, culture, art, and share lived experiences. Welcome aboard. In this episode, we will dive into secondhand shopping in Mongolia and how it's evolved over the past few years. In Mongolian culture, it's believed that clothes carry the energy or spirit of the person who wore them. So secondhand clothes aren't just a bargain, they come with a story, a presence. We'll get into the cultural roots of this belief and how modern thrift culture is taking over among young Mongolians and how they are challenging the traditional belief. First, I want to share about my story of getting introduced into thrifting and how it changed my view of used clothes. My first experience shopping for secondhand clothes at the thrift store was in 2018 when I first arrived in Budapest. It was quite a Western experience for me. Before that, the idea of paying money to buy old clothes that someone else had already worn before wouldn't be an option for me. But it's just my subjective experience. But the idea is that secondhand clothes were not as widely normalized as they are today in Mongolia. For me, eventually I became a regular at the nearest thrift store, vintage shops, digging for unique and affordable pieces, which I do still do today. So, and then when I moved back to Ulaanbaatar in 2020 because of the pandemic, my friend and I had an idea. We opened a small thrift shop, something we hadn't really seen in Ulaanbaatar before. So back then, around 2020, 19, 20, the Western style thrift store didn't really exist in Mongolia. But secondhand clothing wasn't new. We had Komissiin baraa or Komis goods, which had been around for decades. And those Komis goods were bulk imported used clothes from Korea, mainly Japan and China, and they are often sold at the black markets like Narntol or Harhoreng. Though for some people it was normal to buy from Komis, for many people Komis was associated with poverty or bad luck. But over the last few years, that narrative has been shifting. Thrift shops have started popping up everywhere, rebranding secondhand fashion as something cool, conscious, and sustainable, which is true. Just a quick reminder, I've started posting weekly blogs on our website, and last week's post was about must-visit thrift spots in Ulaanbaatar. I featured 5 thrift shops that you'll definitely want to check out if you love thrifting. You'll find out info on what makes each places unique and their price ranges and much more. You can also catch the post on our Instagram page too. For people who grew up in Mongolia, we are familiar with these kind of sayings about secondhand clothes. For example, if you wear a stranger's old clothes, you'll take on their suffering. We say that "Хүний зовлонгон авна" or you'll get polluted, as in "Бозарт шүү." It can be different for Gen Z or those who was born and grew up in the city, but these aren't just casual warnings. They reflect a deep-rooted cultural belief, which is that clothing can carry energy, and not just any energy, someone else's pain, misfortune, even bad luck. So for a long time, buying used clothes wasn't just seen as undesirable, it was kind of a taboo. Back then, secondhand clothes came mostly from Komissiin baraa, literally commission goods. The word komis likely came from the Russian word komissiya, meaning commission. And in Mongolia, it became associated with donated or charity clothing. And it wasn't glamorous, it wasn't trendy, it was something you did maybe quietly, just out of necessity. Now, behind all this stigma around secondhand clothes, there's something deeper, traditional cosmological belief. In Mongolian traditional belief, we each carry sult and humor, which is our life force and vitality. These aren't just abstract ideas, they're what keeps us strong, grounded, and well. But here is the catch: these forces can weaken. People believe they can be contaminated, as in Pozartach, through negative energy, immoral acts, or even something as everyday as mishandling clothes. That's why traditionally clothing was treated with a lot of care, especially with items like hat, belt, and collar of the del. Del is Mongolian traditional costume. You're not supposed to throw them on the ground. Elders would scold you if you just casually throw them on the ground. And swapping hats with someone, that's like trading your spirit. The collar part of any clothes, in particularly, is seen as holding the owner's humor. So, when discarding an old tail, you'd remove the collar first to symbolically protect your spirit. Also, many people prefer to just burn their clothes rather than donating or giving away. For example, when someone goes through a streak of bad luck or feels like their energy is missing, it's often believed that their humor or sult has left them. In those cases, they visit a monk who performs a ritual to restore it so that they can call their spirit back. And also, there is the trade side of things. Comic shops weren't just selling old clothes, they were part of Nema, a kind of small scale private trade. In Mongolia, Nema has long carried a negative undertone. Historically, it was associated with Chinese merchants, Nemachit, and they were seen as exploitative, driven by greed and driven by short term profit. So, when you mix that economic distrust with the spiritual fears around secondhand clothes, it's easy to see why Komissiin baraa had a bad reputation. Still, despite the stigma, these shops feel the real need, especially for the economically vulnerable and those homeless people. And they existed in that space between practicality and taboo. If you're loving this podcast, share this with a friend who's all about Mongolian culture. And don't forget to subscribe and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform because it really helps others to discover the show. And if you'd like to support my work and hear more stories from Mongolia, you can always buy me a coffee. And thank you so much. So, thrift shopping as we know it today has its roots in the late 19th and early 20th century America and Britain. It started with religious charities like the Salvation Army, Goodwill, which collected donated clothes, repaired them, and sold them at low prices, partly to support the poor and partly to offer jobs to those in need. And over time, thrift shops evolved from being places of desperate need to places of charitable giving, affordability, and it became more stylish and trendy. Across the decades, secondhand shopping slowly gained new meanings, connecting with sustainability, even self expression, and obviously a rejection of fast fashion. But here in Mongolia, this cultural shift took a bit longer to arrive. It wasn't until around 2020 that thrift shopping really began to gain um, traction in Ulaanbaatar. Secondhand fashion really started to catch on among young people in Mongolia over the past few years. And a big turning point was the opening of Toirog, a thrift shop that's often credited as the first to truly reintroduce used clothing within the local market. Of course, secondhand clothes weren't new. Common shops had been around for decades, though often seen through a lens of stigma. But thrift shops like Toirog brought a new energy. They reframed secondhand as something ethical, stylish, and aspirational. So, Toirog means circle in Mongolian, and the name reflects their mission to keep clothes circulating, reduce waste, and push back against the stigma of secondhand clothing. Toirog reintroduced used clothes under a new label as pre-loved, not old, and they often use phrases like giving clothes a second life. So these phrases reframed secondhand shopping not as a last resort, but as an act of environmental care, rescuing garments from landfills and extending their stories. And for me, what's truly impressive is how Turk has built more than just a shop. They created a whole community of young, environmentally conscious thrift enthusiasts. For many, today, Targ is not just a place to buy clothes, it's a social space, it's a hub where young people find a sense of belonging, shared values, and creative self expression. And Targ's vibe is distinctly nostalgic. For example, their interior is full of retro style furniture, old stereos, rugs on the wall, and Soviet era decors. And this aesthetic gives young Mongolians, for whom many of them never lived through the socialist decades, and it gives a way to connect to the past and perform a sense of identity. Other thrift shops in Ulaanbaatar have followed this path too, mixing retro decor with curated fashion, with locally made accessories, handmade crafts, and also even with coffee corners and hangout spots. So nowadays in Ulaanbaatar, thrift shops aren't just the places to shop, they're places where identity, sustainability, and community all mix together. For younger Mongolians, wearing secondhand isn't a fallback now anymore. It's a choice, it's a statement. And by the way, I didn't finish my thrift shop story. So I moved back to Ulaanbaatar in 2020, and after a year in 2021, my friend and I opened a small thrift shop called Retro Radio. It was a precious little place. We decorated the place to evoke the feeling of typical 90s Mongolian home, space filled with nostalgia. And we ran the shop for about a year and a half before, unfortunately, we had to close it. And aside from being a thrift shop, we also offered a consignment service, selling customers used clothes and paying them back, which gave more people a reason to participate in secondhand culture. Since we opened after Turk launched their thrift shop and their amazing campaigns that reframed the narrative around used clothing, that momentum really helped us, actually. And I truly believe Turk paved the way for many other thrift shops that came after them. So you might ask, what happened to the belief that clothes carry one's energy? Today, we can see a generational shift in attitude towards secondhand clothing. Young Mongolians are proudly choosing used clothes. They're embracing thrifted fashion as a way to express individuality and also to support sustainability, challenge the stigma once attached to secondhand clothing. But that shift isn't one size fits all. Some younger thrift shoppers are still carrying a thread of traditional belief, which is okay. They are carefully avoiding, for example, items like hats or belts out of respect for old customs and cosmological caution. So they're blending modern values with cultural roots, and they're shaping a new narrative for secondhand clothes in Mongolia. Today I saw an Instagram post that said 69, almost 70% of our clothes wearing today is made out of fossil fuel material, which is polyester. Polyester is a synthetic fabric derived from petroleum. So you can see that most of the clothes are today made from polyester, which is we are wearing these plastic clothes made from petroleum. And that's why I prefer to thrift, because actually you could find old clothes that was made before this fast fashion era, which is very good in terms of fabric. You could have more option with cotton and linen clothes, because nowadays all the clothes are made with polyester. And I also read that polyester stays up on the landfill up until 200 years, and now there are like mountains and oceans full of this fast fashion waste. So at the end of this podcast, I want to convey a message that please reduce, recycle, and reuse. Thank you for listening to this podcast, and if you'd like to keep up with Mongolia, make sure you subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and everywhere else. Хавд байсан маш их баярлалаа. Баяртай.